Tip-tap shoes, hear that stomp. Pull up a chair, let your shoulders hop. Tiny tales from the tallest trees. Mini pines come and sway with these. Hey, mini pines, true crime time. Kick up your heels as the stories unwind. Relax your mind, let the past chime in. We laugh, we learn, let the good times spin. Mini pines, true crime time. Sip a little calm while the decades rhyme. Settle right in as the ages sing. History's a hoop with a little swing.
Welcome back in. Good evening, and thank you for joining me on this episode of Mini Pines. So tonight, I'm going to take us into the Pacific Northwest, well, as always. And I'm going to explain to you why, when you're out in the dark, in the forest, you don't whistle. There's a rule that some people in this part of the country still follow, even today. People who grew up on the reservations of Western Washington and the Cascade foothills along the river valleys, their parents or grandparents told them plain and simple, don't whistle at night. No explanation, just don't. If you pressed for a reason, you might get a look, maybe a word or two. Something will hear you. And if you were a kid who pushed further, who said, what something, you'd probably get the same answer most kids got. A story. Just enough of a story to make sure you didn't push any further. And tonight, I want to tell you about what was on the other end of that whistle. Welcome back in. It's me, Becca. I appreciate you being here tonight. And the stories of the Pacific Northwest can become rather layered. The stories that don't quite fit anywhere else, the legends that have too much or too little texture just to wave off. Tonight's topic has been on my list for a while. We're talking about the Stick Indians, the one called the Night People, the tsiatko, the Seatco, the ones most people in their oral tradition don't name at all, because naming them is considered a way of drawing their attention. I'll do my best to treat this story with care, because there's a real tension in an episode like this. These beings are part of a living tradition for a number of indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest. They're not ancient history. They're not folklore that's been safely filed away. People still tell these stories, still pass on the warnings, still feel the weight of them. And on the other end of that spectrum, these beings have been pretty thoroughly absorbed into cryptid culture, the Bigfoot adjacent world, the paranormal community, Reddit threads, and YouTube channels. The two versions of the story don't always look the same, and I think it's worth spending some time on both and being honest about where one ends and the other begins. So, let's start at the beginning. The Salish people are a large and diverse culture grouping across the Pacific Northwest, interior and the coast, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, British Columbia. Their oral traditions are among the richest and best documented in the region, and in no small part because of the work done in early the 20th century by a man named Arthur C. Ballard. Ballard wasn't officially an anthropologist. He was an Auburn, Washington city clerk, also a school teacher, and deeply fluent in multiple languages, including Lushootseed, the language of the Puget Sound Salish tribes. Starting in 1916, he began visiting reservations and sitting with the elders, recording traditional stories in their original linguistic form. His primary contact was a man named John Zott, born around 1845. John Zott knew the old stories, and Ballard wrote them down. His major published work, Mythology of Southern Puget Sound, came out in 1929. It's one of the foundational documents for understanding the folklore of the region, and it includes some of the earliest detailed written accounts of the beings the Salish called tsiatko. What the source describes is consistent across tribes, even where the details shift. A race of beings sometimes called the Night People, sometimes the Wild Ones, and sometimes just them, living in the deep forest. They didn't build structures. Their homes were hollowed out spaces in the earth and brush. indistinguishable from animal dens. They traveled only on land, never on water. They didn't cross rivers, and they were almost entirely creatures of darkness. They slept by day. At dusk, they moved. Their language wasn't human speech. It was something closer to birdsong, to animal calls, a series of whistles varying from low to high. They communicated with each other this way, and the whistle carried through the forest at distances that seemed impossible. You could hear them long before you could see them, and you usually couldn't see them. The Nisqually tradition describes a creature called tsiatko, a term that comes from the Chinook jargon trade language and roughly translates to spirit. But the Nisqually tsiatko is a specific kind of dangerous, described as having the form of a man, but larger, quicker, and almost completely silent when it wanted to be. This tsiatko, one historical account says, inhabits the dark recesses of the woods, where his campfires are often seen. He sleeps by day, but sallies forth at dusk. He steals from traps, breaks canoes, takes food. He waylays travelers, and he is credited with every misfortune and mysterious death that can't otherwise be explained. The last part is worth sitting with a little bit. In many oral traditions, these beings function as an explanation for the unexplainable. The hunter who didn't come back, the child who wandered off and wasn't found, the person who returned from the forest strangely changed, unable to account for days of their lives. In the tradition, you didn't say, "We don't know what happened." You said, "The tsiatko took him." Now, across different tribes, the physical description varies quite a bit, and I think that's actually important. The Salish of Puget Sound tended to describe the tsiatko as extremely tall, always well over 6 feet, built like men, but outside the range of any tribe, clothed in animal skins, skilled hunters and fishermen. They stole from salmon nets. They took what they needed. Some accounts say they were hairy, and some don't. The Cayuse and Yakima Plateau peoples east of the Cascades describe them differently. Smaller, almost dwarf-like, mischievous in a way that bleeds from prank into menace. The Nez Perce have a version that sounds more like little people. This is something that gets flattened when the Stick Indians get folded into the Bigfoot-adjacent world. There isn't one thing. There are many things. Overlapping names for related but distinct beings, shaped by the ecology and storytelling traditions of each community. The tsiatko of the Nisqually are not the same as the Stick Indians of the Yakima, even though you'll see them stacked on the same Wikipedia page. What's consistent across nearly all of them is this: they are dangerous. They are vindictive. They remember. And you don't want to attract their attention. Here's where the legend gets really interesting to me. Not just what these beings are, but what behavior they demanded. Every good piece of folklore has rules embedded in it. Rules tell you what the community valued, what they feared, and what they needed the next generation to understand. The tsiatko legends are dense with rules. Rule number 1: don't be alone in the forest at night. Now, this one's almost universal. The night belongs to them. If you're out after dark in the deep woods without company, you're in their territory, on their schedule. Children especially were warned over and over not to stray from camp after dusk. One account from Ballard's records describes families on summer camping trips placing children in the center of the group when they slept, surrounded by adults on all sides, specifically because the tsiatko were known to lift the loose sides of mat shelters and take children from the edges. Rule number 2: don't whistle at night. This is the one that stayed most alive in popular memory and in community practice. The Okanagan people, an interior Salish group of south central British Columbia, maintained specifically that whistling at night in the backcountry is likely to bring a tsiatko to you. The reasoning is that whistling is their language. You're calling to them. You're saying in their tongue, "Hey, I'm here." And they will answer. There's a passage I've seen attributed to an interview with an elder from one of the Washington reservations. I'm going to paraphrase it for us tonight, where she says something like, "Even today, you'll hear people my mother's age say, 'You don't whistle at night.' They don't always tell you why. They just say something will hear you. But if you go back far enough, if you were out in the dark and something dangerous was nearby, a whistle tells them exactly where you are." There's a practicality to that, in other words. And this is where the folklore does something I find genuinely wise, which is this. It wraps a survival behavior inside a spiritual warning so that the behavior persists even when the explicit reason is forgotten. Don't whistle. You'll attract something. And even if you're skeptical of what that something is in the deep forest, at night, in the dark, advertising your location is probably not a great idea. Rule number 3, don't disrespect them. The tsiatko are described as incredibly vindictive. They remember slights. They track people. One account from the Puget Sound records describes a man who killed a tsiatko in daylight. They came in the night and are vulnerable in the day, apparently, and was relentlessly hunted by the others. If you injure one of them, even accidentally, if you take from their territory, if you speak of them carelessly in the open where they might hear, they will come back for you. They may not come back immediately, but they do come. Rule number 4, don't say their name. This is the one that cuts deepest, I think. Stick Indians is an English euphemism, a workaround. So is night people. So is Seatco. The actual Salish name, terms like tsiatko, sital, were considered too dangerous to say aloud in public because speaking their name aloud was taken as a way of drawing them, of announcing yourself. The tradition held that the way to stay safe was not to engage with these beings linguistically at all. So you can see why this creature creates a documentation problem, by the way. The name, the taboo, it means beings were deliberately not talked about, especially not to outsiders, which means the written record is thin. And the thin record is largely what got captured by people like Ballard or the Harvard ethnographer George Gibbs, who documented some of the beliefs in Washington in the 1860s. What got written down is what people were willing to say, filtered through translation, filtered through the colonial context in which it was recorded. We should be appropriately humble about what we actually know and what we're extrapolating here. So let me try to describe what an encounter with a tsiatko might look like based on the tradition, because I think the texture of it is important. You're traveling. It's dusk. The forest goes quiet first. That's the thing witnesses consistently describe, not the normal quiet of animals settling in for the night, an absolute silence. No insects, no birds, just a sound of your own feet. Then you hear the whistle, low, then high. Off to your left, you stop, you listen. There's nothing. You start walking again. The whistle comes again, closer or from a different direction. It's disorienting. It seems to move without the sound of movement. And then laughter. Light, almost childlike, from you right now, from somewhere you can't see. The tradition says what happens next doesn't require anything physical. The tsiatko had the ability to induce a specific kind of mental state, a confusion, a dread, a paralysis. Some accounts call it hypnosis. Some even describe it as insanity. Most agree it involved a profound loss of direction. You'd follow the sounds and you'd find yourself somewhere you'd never intended to go, unable to retrace your steps. Hours would be gone, sometimes even days. The phrase I've seen used is, they could make you lost. Not just physically lost, lost in a way that went deeper than geography. This is interesting to me because it maps onto something that's psychologically real. Disorientation in dense forest, especially at night, especially when you're scared, can be genuinely catastrophic. The inner ear has nothing to work with. The visual cues repeat themselves. A tree, another tree. People walk in circles. People have died this way, separated from trails by only a few hundred feet. The folklore takes this real thing and gives it an agent. It gives the lostness a cause. Whether the tsiatko caused the disorientation or whether the tsiatko are a way of understanding the disorientation, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that. What I do think is that treating these stories as simply wrong about what was happening in the forest is missing the point. They were doing something, passing on something true about the dangers of the places in the form that people would remember. It's worth spending a moment on the landscape of related beings because stick Indians don't exist alone. The Dzwonka, spelled Dzoonokwa, is a forest giant of the coastal peoples, particularly the Kawakawaka Wakai of Vancouver Island. Very large, covered in dark hair with pursed lips depicted in art. She's sometimes described as a cannibal, sometimes as a kidnapper of children. Similar function to the tsiatko, but different tradition and region. The slapu appears in the Kalakam area oral histories. A wild woman of the woods who takes children in a large basket. Stories about slapu were specifically designed to keep children close to camp, to make them afraid of wandering. And then there's a figure who has, in the last 70 years, completely dominated the conversation in mainstream culture. Sasquatch, the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot of the Holcomb-speaking tribes of the Fraser River Delta. The name literally means wild man. These beings often get collapsed onto one another. People will say, stick Indians, Sasquatch, it's all Bigfoot. And then there is genuine overlap. The Warm Spring tribes in Oregon, for instance, have described Bigfoot as a stick Indian, a being that steals salmon and leads people astray with whistling. For them, those aren't separate categories. But they're also not the same thing. The tsiatko are nocturnal, avoid water, are associated with mental confusion and supernatural vengeance. Sasquatch tends to be depicted as more animalistic, more neutral, encountered by day as well as night. The Dzwonka have specific coastal ceremonial significance tied to the Hamas dance tradition. Lumping them all together flattens distinctions that the cultures themselves have maintained carefully. And what they share is they all live deep, deep, deep in the forest, and the places humans don't fully control. They're all a way of saying there are things out there that don't answer to us. The wilderness is not empty. Pay attention to it. And I want to say something very carefully here because it matters. These stories don't stop, and they haven't stopped. They didn't get filed away as mythology. They are still being told. The White River Valley Museum in Auburn, Washington, right in the heart of the Muckleshoot ancestral territory, opened an exhibit drawing directly from Arthur Ballard's recorded testimonies in collaboration with tribal members. The exhibit is called Sasquatch ancient native perspectives on the mysterious beings of the woods. The museum director was explicit that the oral histories in it came from elders born before 1880, meaning the chain of transmission goes back before the reservation era, before the treaty period. These aren't stories that were invented to amuse settlers. They're older than the state. And sightings continue on reservations today. People still report hearing the whistle low to high out in the dark. People still won't go out alone at night in certain areas. An elder quoted in documentation of Pacific Northwest traditions broke a habit she'd had her whole life, getting up before dawn to go to the outhouse because of what she'd seen and heard. This woman wasn't in the 19th century. She was contemporary, and she took it seriously. There's something in here that I think deserves acknowledgement. When these traditions get pulled into the cryptid world, and they do consistently, they get treated as evidence in a different kind of project. The question becomes, is Bigfoot real? Do these stories have something physical out there? And the communities these stories come from sometimes feel reasonably that their sacred or serious traditions are being used as footnotes in someone else's mystery hunt. That's not what I want to do here. I think the Stick Indian legends are worth knowing on their own terms, not because they might be evidence of an undiscovered primate, but because they're detailed, long-developed system of understanding the relationship between human beings and the forest they live in and depend upon. They encode danger, ethics, behavior, and the recognition that the world is not entirely ours. That said, I'd be dishonest if I didn't pretend there isn't a whole parallel world of Stick Indian lore that exists entirely outside of Indigenous tradition. There is. It's grown substantially in the last 20 years, turbocharged by the internet, and it has a distinct flavor. In the cryptid version of the Stick Indians, the beings are usually described as very tall and thin, pale-skinned with long limbs, almost insectoid. They're silent in a way that's described as unnervingly deliberate. They're often reported by hikers and campers who say they felt watched, followed. Search and rescue volunteers have described areas where the forest goes completely silent, no insects, no birds, and where whistling starts up the moment a person enters. One account circulating widely in the paranormal community involves an Oregon hunter who says he recorded what he thought was a coyote call, only for it to shift mid-recording into what sounded like recognizable human speech. These accounts are hard to evaluate. Some of them clearly draw on the traditional descriptions, the whistling, the disorientation, the feeling of being hunted by something that holds grudges. Some of them import things from other traditions, the pale-limbed, creeping figure that is more in common with internet horror aesthetics than with anything in the Salish oral record. What's interesting is how consistently people across different encounters describe the same kind of dread, not the jump scare kind, the slow, building, wrongness kind. The sense that something has registered your presence and is making a decision about what to do with that information. The silence, the whistle. Whether that's the power of suggestion at work, people in dark forests already primed by these stories, interpreting ordinary sounds through an extraordinary lens, or whether something is genuinely out there doing something we don't have a great framework for. I genuinely don't know. I don't think anyone does. What I do know is that both types of people, the people who see this through a traditional lens and the people who see this through a cryptid lens, agree on the same practical instruction. If you hear a whistle in the forest at night, don't answer it. Don't whistle back. I've thought about why these particular beings have always fascinated me more than, say, the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot culture. I think it's the intelligence attributed to them. They're not just big, they're not just frightening. They remember, they track, they make decisions about whether what you've done to them warrants a response. They communicate. They have something that functions like culture. They hunt together. They take children for purposes. They react to insult. There's something deeply uncomfortable about a creature that is almost human, not superhuman, not animal, the threshold thing, the thing that lives in the in-between. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are genuinely old. They're genuinely large. There are places in the Cascades and the Selkirks and the Coastal Range where human beings do not go regularly, where the canopy is thick enough to turn midday into dusk, where the sound ecology is completely unlike anything you've ever experienced on a trail. These places, they've been here far longer than any of us. The traditions they grew up around, they're not the traditions of just anybody who's confused about their environment. No, they know exactly what their environment entails. They're the traditions of people who paid extremely close attention to it for thousands of years. So when those people say, there's something in there that is not like us, that resents intrusion, that communicates in a language that isn't speech, I think the appropriate response is to take that seriously. Not necessarily literally, but seriously. Don't go alone into the deep woods at night. Don't whistle after dark. And if something out there in the trees sends a whistle your way, low note then high, don't whistle back. Thanks for joining me this evening. I hope you have enjoyed my story, and the next time you're out taking your little hikes, remember, go in groups and don't respond to those whistlers.
Well, that's our show tonight. We laughed and kept it light. From the first hello to the last bye. That's our show tonight. Thanks for listening. Tip your hat and keep those toes a-twisting. As the lights go low and the band plays out, thanks for listening. That's our show.